I once met a woman named Eleanor on a quiet Sunday morning at a second-hand bookstore near Monterey. She was sitting in the corner, flipping through an old gardening magazine from the 1980s, her gray shawl draped softly over her shoulders like a warm memory. There was something about the way she held the pages, gentle, deliberate, as if every word was a hand she was holding onto. I sat across from her without asking. I didn't need to. The space around her felt open, welcoming like a bench in the shade. She was 75, she told me later. A mother of 3. A former teacher. A widow of nearly 20 years. She smiled as she spoke, but it was the kind of smile that carried a question behind it. One you were too polite to ask out loud. So I didn't. I waited. It wasn't until she closed the magazine and looked out the window that she said it. My children used to call me every Sunday. Her voice didn't break. Didn't have to. The pause did the work. Every single Sunday, she continued. For years. Even when they moved out. Even when they got married. Sunday was our day. She chuckled softly. Sometimes I'd wake up and sit by the phone like a teenager waiting on her prom date. I didn't mind. I liked the anticipation. She turned to me then, her eyes soft but steady. And then one Sunday no one called. And the next Sunday again. Then again. It wasn't that they had forgotten her birthday. They hadn't. It wasn't that they stopped loving her. She was sure they hadn't. It was just that life had gotten louder. Jobs, kids, errands, meetings, holidays planned without her, holidays spent elsewhere. A missed call here, a late reply there. Eventually, the silence was no longer surprising. It was expected. But Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She didn't guilt them with long voicemails or bitter comments slipped into texts. She didn't cry over forgotten dinners or canceled visits. She did something else. I decided to write them a letter, she said, her voice barely louder than the rustle of a page. Not to complain, not to blame, but to remember. I asked what she meant. I wrote to each of them, she said. 3 letters. Longhand. On real paper. I told them about the little things. About the tea I drank that morning, the birds outside my window, the neighbor's new puppy. But I also told them stories they didn't know. Like the time she walked 5 miles to get her son a Batman cake on his 6th birthday because the bakery messed up the order. Or how she once sold her wedding ring to pay for her daughter's first year at college. Or the night she stayed up until 3 a.m. stitching her youngest Halloween costume because he had changed his mind at the last minute and wanted to be a dragon instead of a fireman. I told them those stories, she said, because I think they forgot that I was once the center of their world. She didn't say it with sadness. She said it with grace. Sometimes, she added, we only remember our parents in black and white. But I wanted them to see me in color again. She folded those letters, sealed them with lavender wax, and mailed them without fanfare. She didn't expect anything in return. But what happened next surprised her. And maybe it'll surprise you too. The first response came from her eldest, Daniel. He called just 3 days after receiving the letter. Not texted. Not emailed. He called. When Eleanor answered the phone, she didn't say hello right away. She held the phone against her cheek for a moment, closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, as if she had been waiting to hear his voice not just for weeks, but for years. Mom, Daniel's voice cracked a little. I read your letter 3 times. There was a pause. She let him sit in it. I didn't realize how much I had forgotten, he said. They talked for nearly an hour that day. Not about anything grand or life-changing. They talked about the smell of cinnamon from her kitchen, about how he used to pretend to fall asleep in the backseat just so she'd carry him inside, about the way she used to hum Patsy Cline when she washed the dishes. Do you still hum when you cook? He asked almost shyly. Only when I'm making your favorite soup, she said and smiled, even though he couldn't see it. 2 days later, her daughter Rachel called. This one was different. Rachel didn't start with, "Hi, Mom." She started with, "I'm so sorry." She cried. Quietly but fully. I don't know when I started putting you second. Or third. Or maybe not even on the list at all. Eleanor didn't say, "It's okay." She didn't rush to comfort. She let her daughter sit in that gentle discomfort. Not to punish but to allow space for truth. I read about the dragon costume, Rachel whispered through tears. I had no idea you stayed up all night. You were only 5, Eleanor said softly. I didn't want you to be the only kid without a costume. Rachel laughed tearfully. You always made everything feel possible. There was silence, but it was a warm silence like sitting under a heavy quilt. Then came the last call, from her youngest, Caleb. He didn't talk much at first, just asked if he could come over that weekend. He hadn't been back to the house in months. When he arrived, Eleanor had baked his favorite lemon loaf, the kind with the sugary glaze on top that cracked just right when it cooled. He sat at the kitchen table, the one they used to do homework on. He picked at the crust, looked up at her and said, I've been busy but not too busy. That's the truth. I just forgot how to come home. Eleanor reached across the table, placed her hand on his and said, Then let me show you the way again. There was no lecture, no speech, no emotional performance. Just a mother who chose to reconnect without resentment. And 3 children who suddenly remembered the warmth of their beginnings. Sometimes love is not about making a point. It's about making a path. Her letters didn't scold. They didn't beg. They simply told the truth. The beautiful lived truth of a woman who once made lunchboxes magical, stayed up with fevers, and loved quietly through the decades. And through that honesty, her children found their way back. But there was still one more thing Eleanor had done. Something no one knew yet. Not even her children. Something that would change not just the way they saw her, but how they saw themselves. After that weekend with Caleb, Eleanor felt something inside her begin to shift. Not because her children had finally called, but because she realized something deeper. She had been waiting for years to be seen again, to be needed, to be remembered not just for what she used to be. A mother, a caretaker, a giver, but for who she still was. And so, she began a quiet little project of her own. Every Sunday afternoon, Eleanor would walk to the small neighborhood cafe 2 blocks away. Not to meet anyone, not to impress, but to sit by the window with a cup of chamomile tea and a brown leather notebook. She titled the first page, Things I Wish My Children Knew About Me. The first entry wasn't about her sacrifices. It was about her dreams. I once wanted to travel through Spain alone. I learned basic Spanish at 53, but never went. The next page said, I used to write poetry in my 20s. I stopped when diapers and dinner took up every evening. She filled that notebook slowly over weeks, then months. Not out of sadness, but from a place of rediscovery, of dignity. On page 17 she wrote, I was afraid of becoming invisible after 70, but I realized I just needed to see myself first. One afternoon, the barista at the cafe, Maya, a kind girl in her 20s, asked what Eleanor was writing. She said it so gently, not wanting to intrude. Eleanor smiled and said, I'm writing myself back into my own story. From that day, Maya would always leave an extra cookie next to Eleanor's tea, and they'd exchange short conversations about books, the changing weather, or the scent of lavender on warm days. Maya once said, You remind me of my grandmother, but also someone I want to be. Eleanor didn't reply right away. She just smiled and tucked that compliment into her heart like a pressed flower between pages. And perhaps that was the most surprising part. The world hadn't stopped seeing her entirely. It was just quieter about it. Her children began calling more often, not always with grand conversations, but with the soft check-ins that slowly rebuild bridges. Hey Mom, I saw someone with your exact gardening hat. Made me think of you. Or, do you remember the song you used to hum in the car when it rained? I heard it today. They didn't know about the notebook. They didn't know that Eleanor had finally started using that little Spanish phrasebook again just for fun. Or that she had framed an old photo of herself at 32, in a red coat, smiling without knowing the decades ahead. But that was okay, because Eleanor had stopped waiting to be validated by others. And in doing so, she became radiant. And then on an ordinary Wednesday morning, Daniel called and asked, Mom, could I read some of your writing sometime? She laughed, surprised. What made you ask? You said something during our last call about being afraid of disappearing. And I just thought, maybe if I read your words, I'd see you better. Eleanor held the phone tighter. I'd like that, she whispered. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't viral or life-changing. It was simply the slow, sure rebuilding of closeness. And sometimes, that's the most powerful kind of change. But Eleanor still had one more surprise. One more letter. Not to be sent but to be shared in person. Because love, when written and spoken with truth, doesn't just reconnect, it transforms. It was a Sunday morning in early spring when Eleanor decided the time had come. She wore her pale lilac sweater, the one her late husband once said made her look like a flower blooming in winter, and pinned on a small silver brooch shaped like a feather. It had been her mother's. Felt right. She carefully folded a cream-colored envelope and placed it in her purse. Inside was the letter she had written weeks ago, addressed simply, "To my children." It wasn't dramatic. No scolding, no guilt. Just a piece of her heart in paper form. That afternoon she invited Daniel and Melissa to lunch. No special occasion. Just a home-cooked meal, slow jazz playing in the background, and sunlight spilling through the kitchen curtains like warm honey. They came. A little rushed, a little distracted, but they came. Eleanor watched them laugh at an old joke they both remembered. She served roasted chicken with rosemary, and made sure their favorite mashed potatoes had extra butter. There was lemon pie for dessert, her husband's favorite. He used to say, "Every sweet bite deserves to follow a story worth telling." After they ate, while sipping tea in the living room, Eleanor reached into her purse and quietly placed the envelope on the coffee table. "This," she said, "is something I wrote. No pressure to read it now, or even today. I just wanted to give you a piece of me you might not have seen before." Daniel glanced at Melissa, then gently picked up the envelope. There was a moment of silence, but not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that wraps itself around you like a soft shawl. Melissa leaned in, eyes glistening. "Is it okay if we read it together? Right now?" Eleanor nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course." Daniel unfolded the letter. His voice shook slightly as he began. "My dearest ones, if this feels unexpected, let me start by saying, I'm not writing out of sadness. I'm writing because I love you. Deeply. Fiercely. Quietly, like I always have." The letter went on to share stories from Eleanor's youth. Things they'd never heard. It spoke of her fears, her joys, her longing not just to be a mother, but to be known as a woman. She wrote about the silence after their weekly calls stopped, not with blame but with honesty. "I missed hearing your voices, but I also missed hearing mine." And then came the line that made Melissa reach for Eleanor's hand. "I never stopped being proud of you. I just started wondering if you'd forgotten the sound of me laughing. The way I used to dance in the kitchen when no one was watching." By the time Daniel folded the letter back up, tears were quietly streaming down his cheeks. "I had no idea," he whispered. "You were still carrying so much." Eleanor smiled, not sadly, but with the gentle strength of someone who had finally exhaled after years of holding her breath. "I wasn't waiting for you to fix anything," she said softly. "I just wanted you to see me again. That's all." There were hugs that afternoon, the kind that last a little longer than usual, the kind that whisper, "I'm sorry, I see you now, I love you." They stayed for hours, talking, remembering, listening. And when they left, Melissa turned at the door and said, "Mom, maybe next weekend you could come over to my place. I'll cook this time. I'd love to hear more of your stories." Eleanor nodded, her eyes shining. "I'd like that." As the door closed behind them, the house was quiet again, but no longer empty. It was filled with something sacred, something strong, because that day, Eleanor had done something extraordinary. She didn't just wait to be remembered. She reminded the world, beginning with her own children, that love, when spoken with grace and truth, can reach across even the quietest distances and bring hearts back home.